I grew up reading superhero comic books, particularly from Marvel, because in those days you were either for Marvel, Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, the Hulk, or you were for DC, Superman, Batman, Superwoman. And as far as I could see, all the cool kids were reading Marvel. A key feature of these superhero stories is the tension between the superhero and their other identity. Spider-Man was the nerd, rather angsty scientist Peter Parker. Superman was the somewhat incompetent journalist, mild-mannered Clark Kent. But which one was the real person? The amazingly able and powerful superhero, or the somewhat disappointing, fallible human alternative? Now, those questions about who you are, your identity, are very much alive today. People today define themselves by a particular characteristic: their family, their marital status, their ethnicity, their sexuality, their economic or social status, their politics. And with an identity goes a social pressure to act a certain way. If your family have a long history of being doctors, then it would be no surprise if as a child you grow up and become a medic. If your family have a long history of being burglars, then you may well end up doing that. If you grow up in a particular culture eating certain kinds of food, then you may well want to find shops that have those kinds of food and eat them, and so on. The search to identify our identity can easily lead to a kind of tribalism. I dress in a particular way because I'm a goth, or a Liverpool supporter, or a business person, or an academic, or a refuse collector. And because my political tribe rejects some views, I won't even discuss them. They're not even possible as far as my tribe is concerned. And that fragments society, and it produces the kind of polarisation that we see in American politics, and which British politics could easily slide into. So who are we? Who are you and who am I? The issues that Paul's dealing with in Galatians 2:11 to 21 go right to the heart of these questions, because he's dealing with the question of Christian identity. What makes a person a Christian? How do we come to know God? How do we live as God's people? And Paul teaches here that the most central feature about those who belong to God is that they've accepted God's invitation through Jesus Christ to trust him and walk with him and to receive the benefits of his death. And that determines everything that's most important about them. Paul does that in two parts. First of all, he tells the story of an argument that he had with his fellow apostle Peter in Syrian Antioch in verses 11 to 14. And then he explains the logic of how he responded to Peter in verses 15 to 21. So let's start with Antioch in verses 11 to 14. Antioch is in the north from Jerusalem. It's in Syria in modern terms. It was a large city with a substantial Jewish population, and Acts 11 tells us that that's where the first mixed Jew plus Gentile church was founded. Indeed, Paul himself had spent time with there, because Barnabas had visited the church, seen the wonderful things that were going on, and fetched Paul to help him teach the church. Acts 11:25 to 26 says they spent a year there. This story in verses 11 to 14 happens after Paul's visit to Jerusalem that we looked at last time in chapter 2 verses 1 to 10. Remember, verses 7 to 10 record the agreement that the Jerusalem apostles made with Paul. The agreement was that Paul would take the gospel to the Gentiles, to the non-Jewish people, and Peter and the others would spearhead taking the gospel to Jewish people. But something really strange happens in Antioch. Peter goes to visit this believing community, mixed Jew plus Gentile community, and initially he participates fully with them. Verse 12, he used to eat with the Gentiles. And that means going into their homes, spending time there, because that was where the groups of believers met. And since in those days they had the Eucharist in the context of a meal, it would mean sharing the Eucharist with Gentiles. That fits very much with the picture of Peter from Acts chapter 10, where Peter goes to the Roman centurion Cornelius as God guides him. And Cornelius's household become believers, and Peter stays with them, so that when he returns to Jerusalem at the beginning of Acts 11, he's criticised by the circumcision group for eating with Gentiles. It also echoes the practice of Jesus, who, particularly in Luke's Gospel, is criticised for eating with sinners. Now, a similar issue about who you eat with came up in Antioch. Some people from James came, verse 12. James was the senior leader of the Jerusalem church, Jesus' own brother. He'd come north, and this group from him had come north to Antioch, and they were promoting traditional Jewish views about eating. They were arguing it's wrong for Jews to eat with Gentiles. Now, why is eating together such a big deal? Jewish people assumed that Gentiles worshipped idols rather than the one true God, and that they offered their food in sacrifice to idols. So no Jew could participate with them. Jewish people also knew that Gentiles ate food that they could not eat as Jews: pork, shellfish, and they were horrified at the prospect that they might be offered those by an insensitive Gentile. So if you as a good Jew eat with Gentiles, you're assumed to share in their idolatry and their ignorance about the Jewish law. Food and shared meals are like a big boundary marker, like a wall around being a faithful Jew to keep Gentiles out. They define Jewish identity, and these Jewish believers understand that still to be true of them as Christians. For them, to be a Christian is to be a faithful Jew, and Peter gave in to these people. Paul says he did it in verse 12 from fear. Maybe he was afraid that if he kept eating with Gentiles, it would damage his mission among Jewish people. And other Jewish believers joined in with Peter, verse 13, even Barnabas, who had originally visited Antioch, who had rejoiced in what he saw God doing there. Paul realises what's at stake here, and we'll see him explaining it fully in verses 15 to 21. But now he tells us what he did. He confronted Peter in public, before them all. He calls Peter Cephas, which is his Aramaic name. And he says this is a gospel issue. Our NRSV translates it, they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel. The original is a kind of picture. It says they weren't walking in a straight line with the gospel. They weren't actually right in tune with the gospel. They were deviating. Paul says that Cephas is acting inconsistently with the gospel, because before James's people arrived, he lived like a Gentile, not like a Jew. He ate with Gentiles. But by stepping away from sharing meals and thus sharing the Eucharist with Gentile believers, Peter's effectively attempting to force these Gentile believers to live like Jews, to accept Jewish limitations about food and table fellowship. And Paul is horrified by Peter's actions, and he goes on to explain why.